In this episode, I will be talking about sexual violence, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, and grooming. No explicit details will be shared, but please take good care of yourself as you listen. If at any time anything feels too heavy, please step away and come back when you're ready, because you matter more than this episode. How does a 13-year-old boy commit a sexual offence against a girl he goes to school with and believe that is acceptable? And why does a boy who grows up watching a man hurt a woman in his own home repeat that same behaviour 10 years later and call it normal? And how are girls being groomed online, moved off social media and onto encrypted apps, exploited, and then used to recruit other girls? And why is this still happening? I'm asking those questions because the numbers ask me to ask those questions. In 2024, in the UK, over 122,000 child sexual abuse and exploitation offences were recorded in England and Wales, a 41% increase since 2015, and half of those offences were committed by children aged 10 to 17. Some of that increase is down to better recording, more children and adults feeling able to report, but not all of it. The number of victims under 10 years old is rising. Online offences are up, and over half of all recorded cases are child on child. Something is being taught, and it's being taught young. Greetings, welcome to Like Me Officially. I'm JK, and this is where raw truths meet reflection. This is where I challenge social narratives, explore the issues that matter, champion self-efficacy, and move beyond surviving life-changing experiences into courage, self-assurance, and thriving. Because if you're anything like me, you'll recognize that life is for living and living freely. #our time to thrive. In this episode, I am talking about who is shaping and influencing our young people and who is responsible for what they're being taught now. I've always asked the why and how questions because I believe for something to change, you have to try to understand the root cause. Malcolm X wrote, "Why am I as I am? To understand that of any person, his whole life from birth must be reviewed. All of our experiences fuse into our personality. Everything that ever happened to us is an ingredient. Every single thing is an ingredient. And right now, we have to look at the entire ecosystem that is feeding ingredients to our young people. Every touch point, from the entertainment they watch to the lifestyle brands they buy into, from every adult in their life to the painful absence of one, right down to their raw experience of their perception and experience of love, care, and support. Every piece of that ecosystem holds its own level of accountability for how harm looks to a young person, how it's presented, and how it's absorbed. Because harm isn't always visual, it isn't always verbal. Sometimes it's seen quietly from the stairs. I can follow the root cause back to some extent from my own experience of seeing domestic violence, watching it happen in real time as I sat on the stairs, also being sexually harmed multiple times before I was even 23. But understanding the context doesn't mean the harm was justified. What understanding gives me is an opportunity to question, to demand better from our governments, our leaders, and even myself. And if you've been at the end of harm, I'm sorry. But know this, it wasn't your fault, and you're not responsible for the harmful actions of others. Now exhale. The issues of sexual violence in the UK and globally aren't reducing, they're increasing. And in the age of AI, things are getting worse discreetly and in plain sight. I say discreetly because the exact same things that were happening when I was in secondary school over 25 years ago are still happening today, just in a different way. This isn't a shot at a specific gender, but the reality is young people, specifically adolescent boys, are being shaped by ideas and influences that are updated daily by official and unofficial sources, from parents to influencers, and consumed at many touch points, consciously and unconsciously every single day. In 2010, reported rape in England and Wales stood at around 16,000 cases a year. By 2025, that number was over 70,000, fourfold in 15 years. The government's response is a 10-year strategy to halve it. I'll come back to that. When people talk about what's actually influencing young boys, there are a few names that typically come up. I'm not going to call those names out, not because they aren't relevant, but because this is not about highlighting them further, but it's about showing their contribution to the ecosystem that is influencing our boys. The word manosphere first appeared in 2009 on Blogspot. Manosphere is a play on the word blogosphere. It described a loose collection of online spaces where men talked to other men. That's where it started. What it evolved into, what it became, is a different conversation. The manosphere has been documented in government strategy, academic research, charity reports, and parliamentary debates. It has been identified as a contributing factor to violence against women and girls. That is not my opinion, it's what the research is saying. So when I talk about it here, I'm not talking about men with traditional values or strong views on masculinity. I'm talking about a documented ecosystem of content directly linked by researchers and government to harm. That distinction matters. Movember is a UK-based charity that has funded some of the most significant research into young men's health. They describe the manosphere not as a single movement, but as an ecosystem, a city with different neighborhoods. And that framing also matters because it changes the question entirely. The question isn't why are boys watching dangerous content? The question is, where did they start? Because most boys don't start at dangerous. They start at a neutral place with a natural desire to explore and to be liked and be relatable to their peers, which they may connect through fitness, sport, gaming, music, self-improvement, how to be more confident, how to make money online. November calls these cultural touch points. On their own, there is nothing to be alarmed about. But here's what happens next. The algorithm, specifically social media algorithms, which are aimed to capture and keep young people's attention, begins connecting those touch points to something which may have started from following a trend to honest curiosity and interest. Self-improvement becomes a conversation about why men are being held back. Fitness becomes a conversation about dominance. Talking to and getting a girlfriend becomes a framework where girls and women are a resource to be acquired rather than people to be respected. It doesn't happen in one video, it happens across hundreds and gradually without anyone noticing, including the boy watching. Movember describes this as an inverted iceberg. Above the surface, you have fitness, motivation, self-improvement. All looks fine. What sits underneath, growing over time, is where the concern is. Now, people hold different views on life, on gender, masculinity. That's not the issue. The issue is what happens when those views are used to fill a gap that should have been filled by something else entirely. And here's how it tends to move. It starts with something real: loneliness. A 2019 UK survey found that 88% of 18 to 24-year-olds experienced loneliness to some degree, and 24% said they felt lonely often. Loneliness isn't always the absence of people. Sometimes it's the absence of feeling seen, understood, or safe enough to be known. The need to belong, the search for direction. Every young person has those needs. They're legitimate. Then comes a diagnosis nobody asks for. The world is set against men. Women have too much power. You've been lied to. And for a young person who already feels unseen, it lands deeply. Then comes a target. And once there's a target, the research shows what can follow. Not in every case. Most boys who consume this content don't go on to commit violence, but the research is consistent. The more of this content a young person consumes, the more normal those attitudes start to feel. Attitudes are where behavior starts. Dehumanization is the step before harm, and that's the connection. 63% of young men aged 16 to 25 in the UK regularly engage with masculinity influencer content. November's 2025 research, more than 3,000 young men were surveyed. And more than 80% of 16 and 17-year-old boys in the UK have consumed content from the most prominent figures in this space. More than the proportion who could name the Prime Minister, and that is not the fringe issue, that's a mainstream one. And it's not just influencers. UK drill music has been cited directly in UK court cases involving gang recruitment and violence against women. And it's worth acknowledging something else, because this same conversation happened with house and garage music in the 1990s. Violence associated with certain clubs, and before that there was rock music, and before that there was something else. The pattern is that society tends to react to the people associated with a gene more than the gene itself. So when violence occurs around a football match, a rock concert, or a nightclub, we don't always ask the same questions with the same urgency. And yet, research in England has found that reported domestic abuse incidences increase around major England football matches. One study found a 26% increase when England won or drew, and a 38% increase when England lost. Most recent research suggests alcohol is a significant factor in that increase. The pattern is consistent. Influence and environment shape behaviour, and that's the point. And the UK's own research is increasingly moving beyond individual content and looking at the wider digital environment. The Youth Justice Board recently published an evidence review. Proven sexual offences committed by children rose by 47% in 1 year and a further 6% the following year. 33% of children reported seeing content online that encourages violence against women and girls. And the review specifically warns that algorithm-driven content can amplify misogynistic attitudes and normalize harmful behaviour. That's a UK government body saying that online environment is changing how some children think about women and relationships. Teachers across the country are reporting boys repeating misogynistic messages in school, and female pupils are saying they're scared of what boys might say or do to them. Barnardo's, a UK children's charity, found that 1 in 7 girls aged 13 to 15 had been asked to send nude images. A quarter had been called degrading names online. So I'm not saying one gang, one influencer, or one video creates an offender. I'm saying and exploring whether repeated exposure to messages that normalize objectification, domination, and disrespect changes what feels normal. The UK's own research suggests that's something that should be taken seriously, and it isn't only boys being shaped by this. Girls are being groomed online, moved off social media onto encrypted apps, exploited, and then, and this is the part that really gets said, used to recruit other girls. Older people targeting younger girls through the same platforms, with compliments, gifts, money, then control. 91% of indecent images of children identified in 2024 were self-generated. either shared willingly or obtained through manipulation. The peer norm has shifted, and it's shifting on the same platforms where all of this lives. Girls cause harm too, that's documented, and those girls were also shaped by the same system. All of this didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. When I look back to 2010, during that period, there was a programme of austerity which began the UK. And this is where government policies were designed to reduce public spending, lower government borrowing, and or reduce national debt over a decade. This included cutting funding to youth services in England by 73%, nearly 3/4. The impact was that more than 4,500 youth work jobs were gone. More than 760 youth centres were closed. And a youth centre back then was seen as the central location for a lot of young people to hang out, a place where trained adults could build long-term relationships with a young person, becoming a mentor, enabling them to spot early signs, ask the questions nobody at home is asking. Not necessarily glamorous work, but the work that filled the gap between what a family could do and what a child needs. When those centres closed, nothing replaced them. The spend per child in England dropped from 158 in 2010 to 37 by 2021. So that's £37 a year per child. At the same time, child poverty was rising. 4.5 million children in the UK are now living in relatively low income after housing costs. 31% of all children, an increase of 900,000 since 2010. And in a classroom of 30 children, 10 are in relatively low income homes. And nearly 3/4 of those children are in working families. Their parents are working, but it's still not enough. That's a structural failure, not a personal one. So by the mid-2010, here's what existed. A generation of young people grown up with less access to trained adults outside the home. Families under financial pressure, schools stretched, communities that had their infrastructure removed. And into that gap came the smartphone, social media, the digital algorithm, a system designed to maximize engagement. And it's very good at finding its target, i.e., young people who felt unseen. And I want to be mindful about what I'm saying here. The algorithm didn't create lonely boys. It didn't create the wound. The algorithm finds the wound and keeps showing content that speaks to the wound. Male loneliness, the need for belonging, the search for purpose, none of this is new. What's different now is what got built around that wound, the gap that's open and what's being used to fill it. Previous generations of boys found belonging in youth clubs, sports teams, faith communities, and the kind of informal mentoring that happens when a responsible adult shows up. Some still do, but for a significant number, those structures aren't there anymore. And the manosphere is. It's accessible, it's free, it's available at 2 a.m. in the morning. It says, I see you, I know what you're going through, and here's why. That's a powerful offer to a young person who feels unseen. The problem was never the need, the problem is who is answering the need. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do sometimes wonder whether we've underestimated how much influence the digital world has on young people. Maybe it didn't start out with bad intentions. Maybe nobody sat down and planned for boys to spend hours consuming misogynistic content, or for outrage to become a business model, or for algorithms to shape how millions of young people see themselves and others. But intention and impact aren't the same thing. Sometimes harm isn't created because someone planned it. Sometimes it's created because nobody stopped to ask what was missing from the plan. The goal was attention. The consequence, influence. And influence left unchecked has a habit of shaping culture. And this isn't only a UK story. As of 2024, more than 520 million children, more than 1 in 5 children in the world, are living in conflict zones. Boys are being actively recruited into armies, armed groups, gangs, and violence before some of them can even read. A UN delegate who was talking about Liberia's 14-year civil war said, when education collapses during conflict, the conflict doesn't end, it mutates. There's no war on the streets of the UK, but something has mutated here too, not through bombs, but through budgets. The conflict didn't end, it's just changed shape. In the UK, there's a drama called Adolescent. It was released in 2025 on Netflix. In the drama, we see a 13-year-old boy who lives in an ordinary house in an ordinary street with his mum, dad, and sister. A family that from the outside looks like any other UK family. The boy committed a crime that nobody thought he could ever commit. Nobody saw it coming. What the drama does well is sit with the question of how, not just what happened, but how does a boy get there? What was the motivation? What was he watching? What did he believe? What did he think was normal? The developing brain is not my area of expertise, but it's a fascinating one and also an annoying one. It's the area that the law in the UK uses in the children's justice system to exempt young people from some criminal actions. I say some because the law is not even. Community service and rehabilitation for raping a young girl on one hand, and a jail sentence and rehabilitation for killing a toddler. Adolescence in general is not simply a phase. Neurologically, it's one of the most significant periods of brain development a human goes through. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term thinking, weighing consequences, regulating emotion, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. Now, again, that is not an excuse for harm, it's a fact. And facts are where useful responses start. A 13-year-old boy consuming content that tells him women are beneath him is not processing that the same way a 35-year-old would. He doesn't have the same tools to interrogate it, to question, to place it in context. What he does is have a brain that is acutely sensitive to social status and peer approval. During adolescence, the presence of peers, real or perceived, activates a reward-sensitive part of the brain that increases the pull towards immediate choices. Being part of a group feels good in a way that is chemical. Being excluded feels threatening in a way that is also chemical. Social media doesn't amplify the most representative voices. It amplifies the loudest ones. Not because they were right or because they reflect most people's views, but because outrage, conflict, desire, sex, cars, brands, and strong reactions keep people engaged. And the algorithm rewards attention, provocation, and engagement, not whether something is true or not. And a feed full of people saying the same thing starts to feel like consensus, like it's truth. That is how these platforms work, and they're working on the most neurologically vulnerable audience. Something else I found in the research that matters. Studies consistently show that young people respond poorly to being lectured, not because they're difficult, but because of how the brain works at this stage. A young person who is neurologically attuned to social hierarchy doesn't respond well to being told what to think by an authority figure. It doesn't feel like respect. Without that, the message doesn't land. Professor Jessica Ringrose at UCL found that 20% of boys react defensively to gender equity lessons, meaning the current approach may actually be making things worse for a significant group. Though I'd want to know more about the sample, for example, locality, the school type, age range, That because I think that context matters. You can't talk someone out of a belief by making them feel they're being talked down to, especially not at that age. The research suggests that what actually works is relationships, consistent long-term relationships with adults who show up before a problem becomes a crisis. Peer-based approaches, because if group belonging is neurologically powerful at this age, the answer isn't to remove it, it's to change what comes attached to it. Emotional literacy, teaching boys early, not at secondary school, early, that naming a feeling is not weakness. And real community, not just a digital feed, actual people in actual spaces who show up. That's what the research points to. And it's almost entirely absent from what is currently being funded and invested in. Because these influencers are being paid to share their opinions alongside selling a dream, a way of life, or a lifestyle attitude. Their developing brain is not an excuse, but it's a window, a time-limited window where the right adult, the right community, and conversation can go as deep as the wrong one. Timing matters, not just what, but when. The UK Violence Against Women and Girls Strategy 2025 has a focus on secondary schools. The research says entrenched attitudes can already be present in primary school. So basically, we're arriving late to a conversation that has already started somewhere else. I'm not a parent, so I tread carefully when it comes to other people's children. I ask questions, but I ask with care. I have a nephew, he's 17. I've been having conversations with his mum, my cousin, that I think many families should be having right now, or need to be. And my recent question was, what are you teaching my nephew about consent, about how to treat girls, about self-protection? Because I believe that goes both ways. And my cousin didn't disappoint. We're always having those conversations, and that's all I needed to hear. She and his dad are choosing to be the biggest influences in their children's lives through conversations, consistently and deliberately. And that's the point. Not every child has that. Some have one adult making that choice, some have none. And in that gap, where there's none, something else moves in. The questions aren't new. What are we teaching our boys? What are they learning when we're not in the room? What's changed is the size of the room. So if I go back to when I started this episode, I had 3 questions. How does a 13-year-old boy commit a sexual offence against a young girl he goes to school with and believe that's acceptable? Why does a boy who grows up watching a man hurt a woman repeat that behaviour 10 years later and call it normal? And how are girls being groomed online and used to recruit other girls? And why is it still happening? The how is the ecosystem. The why is the loneliness, the wanting to belong, and the gap that's being filled. I know this personally. I was a young girl who not only heard but saw my dad lay hands on my mother. I saw with my own eyes how she fought back. What I saw registered. Even now, I see it play out like a film. It translated into my own hyper-awareness, my sensitivities, my auto-responses to different situations that I still carry today. But also, it gave me the fuel to fight back. When I was threatened by the hands of a guy I was seeing my mother fight back helped me to fight back and prevent something irreversible happening. What we witness influences us. That was my experience. Many people have different ones, and I'm not here to compare. The point I'm trying to make is that what we witness influences us. It stays with us. It shapes how we respond to the world. Sometimes years later, in situations where we feel threatened. And that is true for girls and it's true for boys, which is why the question of what we allow young people to witness in their homes, on their screens, in the culture around them, is not a small question, it's everything. The UK government's Violence Against Women and Girls strategy names boys and young men directly. The Prime Minister's own words, this is about protecting girls and driving forward education and conversation with boys and young men, which is a responsibility we owe to the next generation. Now, I don't disagree, but should all of that responsibility be with the government? Policies matter, strategies matter, but a strategy can't raise a child. It can't sit around the dinner table, and it can't have the awkward conversations. And a strategy can't drive a teenager to football training on a Saturday morning, and it can't spot a change in behaviour, and it can't notice when something feels off, and it can't ask the question that might change a situation. A strategy can't be present, but people can. No policy program or action plan can replace the everyday influence of parents, carers, teachers, coaches, friends, and communities, because culture isn't changed by documents alone. It's changed through people. The government can set the framework, but it can't be the village. And if we wait for the framework to do the work that only a village can do, the numbers won't halve. The research and the history of previous strategies tells me exactly what happens when ambition isn't matched by delivery. We've seen it in the UK before. Governments are starting to act on the digital side too, which is great. Australia passed a world-first law in late 2024 requiring social media platforms to prevent under 16s from having accounts on TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and others. They put the burden on the platforms, not the parents. 4.7 million under 16 accounts have already been restricted. And here in the UK, the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Act 2026 requires restrictions on social media for under 16s. A full ban was debated and voted down in the Commons by 307 to 173. And then there's China. China limits under 18s to 1 hour of gaming on specified days. TikTok's Chinese version limits under 14s to 40 minutes a day. They've had those controls in place for years, and despite that, children are still evading them and still getting into trouble, which shows that restriction is not the same as protection. You can limit the time, but if the wound is open, the content will find the wound somehow and somewhere. And here's what the legislation doesn't reach: the influencers on the main platforms who have email lists, podcasts, private channels, Telegram, Discord, WhatsApp groups, live events, merchandise, word of mouth. The laws address the most visible part of the problem, and the ecosystem is much wider than any age restriction can reach. So restriction matters, but it isn't enough on its own. These restrictions are a start, and eventually they'll become normal and an expected part of how children are raised in the digital age. But young people don't respond well to being told what they can't have. A restriction on what they see as their right and their freedom creates resistance, not safety. So alongside restriction, investment needs to go back into innovative spaces that give young people something better to move towards, healthier touch points, empowering ones, spaces that support their development into adulthood rather than exploiting the gaps in it. There are small charities doing this work right now with limited funding, In the digital age, more reach is possible, but more funding is needed. And we need to start having conversations with young people, not swatting them away, creating opportunities for both casual and serious conversations, making it normal for an adult to ask the question and making it normal for a young person to respond. The village, men's groups, sports clubs, faith communities, even recruitment hubs, entertainment, music, gaming platforms held responsible and accountable for their algorithms that engage with children, organizations with a genuine remit for young people, parents, godparents, guardians, safeguarding systems that talk to each other, connected through databases to the police, home office, adults who choose, like my cousin and her husband, to be the biggest influence in their children's lives. We don't all have to think the same. We don't all have to have the same capacity or access. But Proverbs 22:6 is a strong proverb that has stayed relevant for many thousands of years for a reason. And it says, train up a child in the way he should go. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. It doesn't say hand them a government strategy. It doesn't say wait for a school assembly. It says train them up. Someone has to show up consistently with intention before the algorithm does. I asked my cousin one question and it started a great conversation. And that's all it takes to start. In 2010, reported rape in England and Wales stood at around 16,000 cases a year. By 2025, over 70,000, fourfold in 15 years. The government's target is to halve it in 10 years. Even if that target is met, and there is serious evidence reason to question whether it will be, we would still be living in a country where tens of thousands of women and girls are harmed every year, where those numbers would still be higher than when the cuts began, when the youth clubs closed, when the funding stopped. Halving violence is not justice, it's just the flaw, it's the basic necessity and right. And we have been asked to treat it as the ceiling. This is not an attack on young people, not on boys, not on a generation. This is a call to attention about where responsibility actually lands in an ecosystem that has increasing influence over young lives. We have freedom of speech, but freedom of speech with no accountability is harm. It's an abuse of young minds, and it needs to be called out. If the government is serious about halving violence against women and girls, it needs to go in at the root. Not only pull out the weeds, but fill the gap. Not just with preventative measures, with growth measures designed to empower young people, to reduce loneliness, to better prepare them for a brighter future. This is what halving violence actually requires. I remember the road I grew up on. Everyone knew my family, and we knew everyone on that road, which meant everyone had an eye on someone for all the right reasons. That road was the village. Whitney Houston sang the words, "I believe the children are our future," and they are. If the village can hold their attention long enough, if we can get there before the algorithm does, there is a real opportunity to turn the tide and to create more leaders, not followers, and reduce sexual harm and violence sooner rather than later. Boys are watching, the girls are watching. Question is what they see, because somebody taught them, because somebody is teaching him that, somebody is teaching her that. And somebody can teach them something different, but only if we decide that's the village we want to be. I spent years understanding that the ecosystem that births, develops, and supports young people, every touch point, every adult, every space where a responsible person should have been and wasn't, holds some accountability for how harm is taught, for how it gets passed on, for how it becomes accepted as normal. It's not normal. It never was normal. It was taught, and what is taught can be untaught, but only if we decide that's our responsibility.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Like Me podcast. If anything I've shared has made you stop, think, or see yourself just a little bit clearer, fantastic. I love this for you. I love this for me. And honestly, I love this for us. And if this episode shifted something in you, give yourself a moment to sit with it. And if anything felt a little bit too heavy, speak to someone you trust. What I've learnt is that we don't heal in isolation, and you don't have to carry any of this alone. This space isn't about staying in survival mode. It's about lifting ourselves out of the dimension that has tried to keep us trapped and choosing a version of ourselves that's still becoming. If this resonates with you, share with someone who might need a reminder or a friend. And make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss the next episode. I'm JK. Stay open, stay self-curious, and remember, it's our time to thrive.